You can be the most loved person in the room and still feel completely unseen. There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't begin in silence. It begins in noise, in laughter, in connection. It begins when you're surrounded by people and somehow feel like a ghost drifting through your own life. Maybe you've felt it at a birthday party, at work, even with family. You're present, but something in you is miles away. You nod, you speak, you laugh on cue, but it's all muscle memory. Inside, there's a hollow ache, not loud, not sharp, just empty. And it doesn't make sense, does it? You're not isolated, you're not abandoned, you're not even unhappy, not exactly, but something is missing, and you can't name it. Carl Jung once wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself." You're not unseen because people aren't looking at you. You're unseen because the version of you that matters, the honest one, the raw one, the real one, never gets to speak. That's not social isolation, that's existential invisibility. And the reason it hurts so much is because deep down you remember a time when you didn't feel like this, when your presence felt connected to your soul, when you could speak without filtering, when your eyes met someone else's, and they actually saw you. Now, you're performing, even if no one asked you to. You're carrying a script so well rehearsed that you've forgotten the sound of your own unscripted voice. And here's the truth. This loneliness, this ache in the crowd, it isn't some malfunction. It's not weakness. It's a message, a quiet, persistent one, whispering, "You've gone missing, and it's time to come home." So before we go any further, ask yourself a question most people never do. Who do people think they're talking to when they talk to you? And who's been waiting behind the curtain, quietly watching the whole time? There was a moment, maybe years ago, maybe last week, when you learned something dangerous. If you want to be accepted, don't be all of yourself. Be agreeable, be digestible, be whatever version of you makes other people comfortable. And so you adjusted. You smiled when you wanted to stay quiet. You held your tongue when truth pressed against your teeth. You laughed a little louder, you polished your tone, and slowly, quietly, you started to vanish. The tragedy isn't that you changed. The tragedy is that you got good at it. So good that people loved you for it. They clapped, they leaned in, they said you're amazing. But they weren't seeing you. They were seeing the mask. Jung called this the persona, the public self we wear to navigate the world. It's not inherently false, but it's incomplete. And when the mask becomes the identity, something begins to rot inside. Because love aimed at the mask doesn't reach the heart. You could be admired by thousands and still cry in the shower, wondering why it all feels hollow. You could be the star of the group chat, the life of the party, the one everyone turns to for advice, and still feel unknown. Not because people don't care, but because they've never met the real you. There's a line from a therapy journal, confidential but too human to ignore. A man said, "I watched myself get married like I was watching a stranger in a film. I smiled in the photos, I gave the vows, but I wasn't there." He wasn't numb, he wasn't cold, he was simply gone, buried beneath years of shoulds and shouldn'ts and the soft shame of being too much. And maybe, in your own way, you've done the same. You became what they needed. You gave them someone to celebrate, but you left yourself behind. And the loneliness that follows isn't loud. It doesn't scream. It's subtle. It shows up as a disconnection in crowded rooms. It shows up as a numb scroll through endless messages. It shows up as a dinner with friends where you laugh, but don't remember why. It's not depression, it's dislocation. The self misplaced. So I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, maybe not out loud, but to yourself. If someone complimented you tomorrow, really saw you, really praised you, would you believe them? Or would you wonder if they were loving the mask? Because until you let the real you speak, every compliment will sound like it's meant for someone else. And every room will feel just a little too far away. But there's something extraordinary about this moment right now. You're still here, which means the story isn't over. Which means the mask can come off, not with a crash, not with drama, but like a slow exhale. And maybe, just maybe, the world's been waiting to meet the person behind it. There's a part of you you've learned to keep hidden. Not because it's dangerous, not because it's wrong, but because at some point, someone taught you that if you showed it, you'd lose something. Love, safety, belonging. So you buried it. Your anger, your wildness, your weirdness, your wonder. You edited yourself down to a version you hoped would be easier to love. But those parts didn't die, they became your shadow. Jung called the shadow the totality of the traits we repress, the truths we refuse, the feelings we suppress, the parts of ourselves we pretend aren't there. Not because they're evil, but because they're inconvenient, uncomfortable, hard to explain at dinner parties. And here's the paradox no one talks about. The more you hide those parts, the more disconnected you become. The more refined your mask, the lonelier your soul. Because people can't connect with a performance. They can't love the version of you that's been sanded down to fit their expectations. They can only love what's real. And if the real you is missing, what's left for them to hold? That's why you feel alone, even when you're surrounded. That's why the conversations feel scripted. That's why you walk away from moments that should be fulfilling and feel empty. Because you weren't there, just your representative. There's a novel, not widely read, not TikTok quoted, called No Longer Human. In it, the main character is beloved, charming, always laughing. He plays the clown, the life of the room. But inside, he's unraveling. In his private journals, he confesses, "I have no understanding of what it means to be human." He smiles so often, he forgets what his real face looks like. And maybe you've done that too. Not in the exact same way, but in your own. Maybe you've been the strong one, the funny one, the agreeable one, and maybe piece by piece, that role became your prison. You forgot that your darkness was part of your depth, that your sadness wasn't shameful, that your anger had something important to say, that your softness wasn't weakness. What if the parts you've been taught to hide are actually your most human parts? What if the loneliness you feel in the crowd isn't because others are ignoring you, but because you're ignoring yourself? Jung warned us that what we repress doesn't disappear. It waits. It grows teeth in the basement. It becomes the whisper that says, "This isn't you." It becomes the ache that shows up in your stomach, your chest, your throat. And yet it's not there to destroy you. It's there to reunite you. Because the shadow doesn't want to control you. It wants to be seen. Not judged, not fixed. Just, and the moment you do that, when you finally allow your full self to exist without apology, the crowd may not change, but your place in it will. Because now you're not hiding. You're showing up. And that's where real connection begins. There's an ancient story, quiet, almost forgotten. It doesn't begin with war or glory. It begins with pain. A king, beloved and powerful, is wounded, not fatally, but deeply. And strangely, the wound doesn't heal. The more he tries to ignore it, the more the kingdom around him begins to suffer. The rivers dry up, the land turns barren, the people lose their hope. And no one knows why. They bring doctors, warriors, prophets, all of them fail. The wound remains. Until one day, a young man arrives. He's not famous, he's not wise, he doesn't even know what he's looking for, but he sees the king. He looks past the crown, past the throne, past the myth, and he asks the question no one else has dared to ask. "What ails you, my lord?" That question changes everything. Because the curse was never about the wound itself. It was about the silence around it. This is the legend of the Fisher King. And in Jungian psychology, it's not just a story, it's a mirror. Because every one of us is the king. We all carry wounds we've tried to outpace, explain away, ignore into nothingness. Wounds from betrayal, wounds from abandonment, wounds from shrinking ourselves for love that didn't stay. And yet, the kingdom, the life we build, can't flourish while that wound is denied. The kingdom becomes a wasteland. Have you felt it? You're achieving things, you're checking boxes, you're doing what you're supposed to do. But underneath, the fields are dry. You wake up tired, you go through the motions, you feel like you're performing in a play you didn't audition for. That's not laziness, that's not failure. That's the wound asking to be seen. Marie-Louise von Franz said you have to be lonely so that the unconscious can become stronger. She didn't mean it as punishment, she meant it as initiation. Loneliness pulls us inward. It strips away the noise. It says, enough pretending, now face the truth. So let me ask you the same question that healed a mythical king. What ails you? What truth have you buried so deep you forgot it existed? What part of you has been bleeding while you smile for the cameras? There's no quick fix, no shortcut, no checklist. But there is something sacred in this process. Because when you finally turn toward the pain, not to fight it, not to fix it, but to hear it, you begin to remember yourself. Not the image, not the resume, not the version that pleases others. You. And slowly the wasteland begins to bloom. Most people think the cure for loneliness is other people. More attention, more followers, more texts on your birthday. And when that doesn't work, they assume something's wrong with them. But what if loneliness isn't always a lack of company? What if it's a lack of connection with yourself? The world has trained us to chase noise, to stay busy, to keep scrolling, to keep showing up, to be productive, visible, online. Because in the quiet, things start to surface, and some of those things are hard to look at. So we avoid silence, we fear solitude, we fill every gap with stimulation, thinking it'll drown out the ache. But it doesn't, because the ache isn't asking for distraction, it's asking for attention. Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming your whole self, requires stepping away from the crowd, not forever, but long enough to hear the voice beneath the noise, the one that isn't filtered by fear or people-pleasing or performance. And yes, it's uncomfortable, at first, because when you start removing the layers, when you take off the mask, shut down the noise, and sit in that quiet, you'll meet parts of yourself you forgot existed. The artist you silenced, the truth teller you shamed, the part of you that still remembers who you were before the world told you who to be. That moment, it can feel like free fall, because the identity you built, the version of you that made sense in a noisy world, starts to lose its grip. But that's not the end. It's the beginning. Because beneath the performance, the noise, the survival strategies, there's something quietly waiting for you. A presence, a self, one that doesn't need applause to feel worthy, one that doesn't crumble without attention, one that's not lonely when alone, because it's whole. James Hollis said, "When we are not alone, when we are on our own, then we have achieved solitude." Solitude is not emptiness. It's presence without performance. It's sitting in a room with no one to impress and not feeling incomplete. And once you touch that, everything shifts. You stop chasing shallow connection because you no longer need to prove your worth. You stop tolerating relationships that drain you because you know now what it feels like to be at peace. You stop fearing silence because it no longer echoes with absence. It hums with presence. This is how loneliness ends. Not when someone walks in, but when you do, when you return to yourself, not as an idea, not as a brand, but as a living, breathing, imperfect, radiant presence. And from that place, you don't beg for connection. You attract it, because now you're not asking others to complete you. You're inviting them to meet you. You were never meant to be a stranger to yourself. You weren't designed to live behind a mask, to disappear into a role, to be surrounded and yet disconnected from the one presence that matters most, your own. But somewhere along the line, you were taught to abandon yourself in pieces, to trade authenticity for approval, depth for applause, presence for performance. And now here you are, a life that looks full from the outside, but sometimes feels like an echo chamber. That feeling, that hollow resonance, it's not a flaw. It's a compass, a signal from the deepest part of you whispering, "Come back. Come back to the parts you've forgotten. Come back to the moments you minimized. Come back to the truths you hid because someone once flinched at their power." Robert A. Johnson once wrote, "The cure for loneliness is aloneness." And he didn't mean isolation. He meant reunion. He meant the sacred act of sitting down with yourself without distraction and saying, I'm here, I see you, and I'm not going anywhere. This is what Jung called integration, not perfection, not performance, but the acceptance of the whole self, light and shadow, strength and sorrow, all of it. When you return to yourself fully, something changes in the way the world responds to you, not because the world changes, but because you do. Suddenly you're not performing for love, you're giving it. You're not blending in to feel safe, you're standing in your truth and letting others find you there. And when they do, when real connection arrives, not because you begged for it, but because you allowed it, you'll feel something different. Not intensity, not excitement, but peace. The quiet, grounded peace of being seen because you finally see yourself. So if these words stirred something in you, don't let that feeling pass. Hold it, let it echo, let it become the beginning of your return. And if you feel brave enough, leave a comment, just one word, here. So someone else out there knows they're not the only one in the crowd, wondering if they're the only one who feels this way. Because the truth is, you're not alone. You never were. You were just waiting for your own reflection to come back into view. And now that it has, maybe the crowd doesn't feel so loud anymore. Maybe now you can walk through it, whole,